Let the night settle around you. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go quiet. Tonight, we are going somewhere you have never quite been before. Not to a battlefield, not to a throne room, not to the places history usually takes you. Tonight, we are going to a feast. Not to sit at it, not to eat from it, but to walk behind it, through the door that the guests never used, down the corridor that smelled of smoke and rendered fat and something sweet burning at the edge of a pan, into the rooms that made the magic and then disappeared from the record entirely. Because here is what I want you to sit with before we begin. When you picture a medieval banquet, and most of us have some version of it somewhere in our minds, what do you see? Long tables covered in white linen, candlelight catching the edge of a silver dish, a roasted animal on a platter carried in on the shoulders of men in livery, music drifting from the gallery above, lords and ladies in silk and velvet leaning toward each other, laughing at something, lifting a cup. It is a beautiful image, and it is not wrong exactly. Those things were real. The silk was real. The music was real. The roasted meat, the silver dishes, the candlelight, all of it was real. But here is what that image leaves out. It leaves out the 200 people who made it possible. It leaves out the fires that had been burning for 3 days before the first guest arrived. It leaves out the boy, maybe 12 years old, maybe younger, whose only job for 16 hours was to turn a handle so that the meat above him would rotate evenly over the flame. It leaves out the master cook who had been awake since before dawn, who carried in his head a map of 40 dishes that all had to arrive at the same table at the same moment, at the correct temperature, in the correct order, plated in a way that communicated, without a single word, exactly how powerful the lord of this hall was. It leaves out the women salting and preserving and baking days in advance. It leaves out the men hauling casks of wine up from cellars in the dark. It leaves out all the invisible, exhausting, technically brilliant labor that the feast required, and then consumed, and then forgot entirely. History remembered the feast. History forgot the kitchen. Tonight, we are going into the kitchen. And I promise you, what you find there is more fascinating, more human, more alive with tension and skill and quiet drama than anything happening at the high table. In the hour ahead, we are going to walk through the great hall and see it for what it really was. Not a dining room, but a political stage, a performance of power so carefully designed that every detail of it was a calculated message. We are going to step into the great kitchen, a space so loud and hot and relentlessly demanding that it functioned almost like a separate world within the walls of the castle, governed by its own hierarchy, its own rules, its own brutal logic. We are going to meet the people who ran it, from the master cook, who held a position of genuine authority and genuine danger, down through layers of specialist workers, to the boys at the very bottom, the scullions, the turnspit children, the ones whose names appear in no chronicle and no portrait. We are going to follow the food as it traveled from fire to table, a journey that was shorter in distance than you might think, and infinitely more complicated than it sounds. And along the way, we are going to keep asking the question that I think sits at the heart of all of this. What does it mean that we remember the people who ate and forgot the people who fed them? If you find yourself drawn into this kind of history, the history that lives behind the official record in the rooms no portrait painter ever visited, then subscribe to Dreamy Ages, where this is exactly the kind of journey we take together. Now, let us begin. Close your eyes for a moment if you like. Let me place you somewhere. It is late afternoon in medieval England, let us say the 14th century, a prosperous estate somewhere in the green middle of the country. The light is already tilting toward gold. Somewhere in the fields, the day's work is winding down. But inside the walls of this estate, inside the stone corridors and timber-framed outbuildings and the vast open-roofed kitchen block at the back, the work is not winding down. It is reaching its peak, because tonight there is a feast, not just a dinner, a feast, and everything, absolutely everything, turns on what happens in the next few hours. The great hall of a medieval estate was not simply a room where people ate. It was the most important room in the entire social universe of that household, and the people who used it knew that perfectly well. In the medieval world, the hall was where the lord of the estate demonstrated, publicly and repeatedly, exactly who he was and how powerful he was and how generous he was willing to be. The word they used was largesse, a French word that meant something between generosity and magnificence, but carried a political charge that pure generosity alone does not. A lord who feasted his guests well was a lord who could afford to feast his guests well. A lord whose table was abundant was a lord whose lands were productive, whose household was orderly, whose authority was secure. A lord who invited you to sit at his table was offering you something more than food. He was offering you proximity to power. And the closer you sat to him, the higher up the hall, nearer to the raised platform at the far end where the high table stood, the more of that proximity you received. This is the thing that the image of a medieval feast almost never captures. The seating arrangement was not practical. It was a map. Every single person in that hall knew exactly where they ranked relative to every other person because their seat told them. The high table, elevated on a dais perpendicular to the rest, visible from everywhere in the room, was where the Lord and his most honored guests sat. Below that, the tables ran lengthwise down the hall, and as you moved further from the high table, further toward the doors at the bottom end, you moved further from power. The food was different too. Not just in quality, though it was often different in quality, but in the cuts served, the number of courses, the vessels the food arrived in. Salt was actually a useful marker here. A large, ornate salt cellar, called the nef if it was particularly grand, sometimes shaped like a ship, sat on the high table. To sit above the salt was to be among the honored guests. To sit below the salt was to be present, fed, acknowledged, but not quite of the inner circle. Above the salt, below the salt. The phrase has survived into modern English as a vague idiom. In the medieval hall, it was a precise social instrument. What fascinates me about this is what it tells us about the purpose of the feast. The food was real, the hunger was real, the pleasure of eating was real. But layered over all of that, inseparable from it, was a continuous, elaborate, unspoken performance. The Lord was enacting his authority. His steward was executing it. The servers moving between tables were sustaining it. Even the guests were performing, watching each other, noting who had been seated where, calculating what it meant, adjusting their own behavior accordingly. The great hall was a theater, and the feast was the occasion through which all of it was enacted. Now every theater has a backstage. The great hall's backstage was the kitchen, and the distance between the two, physically and symbolically, could not have been greater. The hall was order. The kitchen was noise and disorder, a place of unrelenting physical demand. The hall was silence and ceremony. The kitchen was noise and fire and shouted commands and the constant percussive rhythm of knives on wooden boards. The hall was the performance. The kitchen was the truth behind it. On a great medieval estate, the kitchen was not a single room. This is one of the first things to understand the kitchen complex, because that is what it was, a complex, typically included the main cooking hall itself with its enormous fireplaces, a separate pastry house where the dough work and baking happened, a saucery for the preparation of sauces and potages, a larder for the storage and preparation of meat, a pantry for bread, salt, and dry goods, a buttery, which despite its name was primarily concerned with barrels of ale and wine rather than butter, and often a separate scullery where the washing happened. Each of these spaces had its own staff. Each had its own chain of command. And over all of them presided the steward, the most senior household official, the person ultimately responsible for the entire operation of the estate. Below the steward in the kitchen hierarchy was the master cook. And the master cook is someone I want you to think about carefully, because the history has not always given this person the attention they deserve. In the households of great lords and kings, the master cook, sometimes called the head cook or the chief cook, held a position of genuine, recognized, documented authority. This was not a servant in the way we might imagine a household servant. This was a professional, a specialist, someone who had spent years, possibly decades, learning a craft that combined chemistry and logistics and artistry in ways that had no real equivalent in the modern world. We actually have the names of some of these people. Guillaume Tirel, known as Théophane, served as master cook to the French royal court in the 14th century and is credited with one of the earliest known culinary manuscripts, the Viendier, a collection of recipes and cooking techniques that gives us a direct window into what high medieval cooking actually looked like. The fact that his name survived, that he was documented, credited, given authority, tells you something about what the role meant at the very highest level. Below the master cook, the kitchen hierarchy continued downward through a series of specialist roles that modern professional kitchens actually still echo, though we have largely forgotten where the structure came from. There were the cooks proper, skilled workers responsible for specific dishes or specific techniques. There were the sauce makers, the pastry specialists, the men responsible for the roasting fires. There were the kitchen clerks who kept track of supplies and expenditure. There were the slaughtermen who prepared the meat before it reached the cooking fires. There were the kitchen boys, a broad category that covered a range of ages and roles, from relatively skilled young men learning the trade to the very youngest workers, some of them children, who were assigned the most physically demanding and least skilled tasks. And at the very bottom of this hierarchy was a figure whose name has become almost a synonym for the lowest possible position in a household. The scullion. The scullion's world was the scullery, the washing room, the cleaning room, the place where the enormous volume of pots, pans, spits, dishes, and vessels used in a day of large-scale cooking were cleaned and returned to use. In a household preparing for a major feast, the scullery never stopped. There was always more to clean. There was always another pot that had come back from the fire with a layer of burned residue that had to be removed by hand, with sand and rags and cold water and patience. The scullion was usually young, sometimes very young, and they worked at the bottom of a hierarchy so steep that the people at the top of it, the master cook, the steward, existed in what must have felt like an entirely different world. What holds me here is the sheer physical reality of what these people endured. We talk about medieval cooking as if it were simply a matter of recipes and techniques, and there was real artistry in it, real knowledge, real skill. But the physical environment in which that artistry was practiced was brutal. The main cooking fire in a great kitchen was not a domestic hearth. It was an industrial installation. Multiple fireplaces, sometimes large enough to walk into, burning continuously. In summer, the kitchen temperature during active cooking would have been extraordinary, easily over 100 degrees Fahrenheit near the fire, with no ventilation beyond whatever the high ceiling and open louvers could provide. Burns were not occasional accidents. They were occupational inevitabilities. Every person who worked near those fires carried scars. The noise was relentless, the crack of the fire, the hiss of fat hitting the flame, the clatter of metal against metal, the shouted instructions of the master cook directing his team through the unceasing pressure of a large feast preparation. And the smell. I want you to think about the smell. Not the pleasant, romantic smell of roasting meat that we might imagine, but the full reality of it, the animal fat rendering, the blood from the butchering still on the floor, the sharp tang of vinegar used in sauces, the sweetness of expensive spices being ground nearby, the smoke that never quite cleared, the faint sourness of old grease worked into the wooden surfaces of the preparation tables. The kitchen smelled like work. Real, physical, relentless work. And in the days before a great feast, it smelled like that for hours upon hours, through the night, without stopping. Because here is something that tends to get lost in the romantic image of the medieval banquet. The feast did not happen in a day. A great feast, the kind thrown to mark a royal visit, a major political alliance, a significant religious occasion, required days of preparation, sometimes weeks. The meat had to be acquired, slaughtered, and prepared far enough in advance to be ready but not spoiled. The pastry work, the elaborate decorated pies, the sugar sculptures called subtleties that arrived at the end of each major course as edible centerpieces required extended preparation time. The sauces had to be made in quantity. The bread had to be baked. The wine and ale had to be checked, measured, and organized for efficient service. All of this was happening in the kitchen complex while, in the hall above, the Lord and his guests went about their days in relative calm, their meals managed, their needs met, the machinery of the household running smoothly around them, largely unseen. The kitchen was always working. The feast just required it to work harder. Now, if you want to understand what medieval cooking at this level actually looked like, what went on to those silver dishes that were carried into the hall with such ceremony, you have to let go of some assumptions. Medieval elite cooking was not simple. It was not rustic. It was not, as some people imagine, just a large piece of meat and some bread. The culinary culture of the high medieval period, roughly the 12th through the 15th centuries, was sophisticated, internationally connected, and deeply attentive to sensory experience in ways that might surprise a modern reader. Spices were central. Not because medieval cooks needed to disguise the taste of rotten meat. This is a myth that historians have worked hard to correct, and the evidence simply does not support it. Spices were used because they were expensive, because they signaled wealth, because they were believed to have medical properties that improved digestion and balanced the humors, and because they genuinely made food taste extraordinary. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, mace, saffron, these came from thousands of miles away, from Asia and the Middle East, through complex trading networks that touched Venice and Genoa and the great markets of the Mediterranean world. To use them generously in your cooking was to announce, quietly but unmistakably, that you could afford to. Color was also important in ways we rarely consider. Medieval cooks colored their dishes deliberately, green from herbs, yellow from saffron, red from sandalwood, white from almond milk. A dish that was beautifully colored was a dish that showed effort, skill, and expense. The Forme of Curie, a collection of recipes compiled by the master cooks of Richard II of England in the late 14th century, gives us vivid evidence of this. It includes recipes for dishes dyed entirely yellow with saffron, for blancmange made with almond milk and sugar and white chicken meat, for elaborate molded jellies that set in layers of different colors. These were not simple preparations. They required skill, timing, and ingredients that cost real money. And they were designed to be seen as much as tasted, to arrive at the table as visual statements about the household that produced them. Perhaps the most striking example of this is the subtlety, the sotelli in medieval spelling, which was an edible centerpiece, usually made of sugar, marzipan, or a combination of both, sculpted into elaborate forms. Castles, ships, animals, religious figures, heraldic emblems. These arrived at the end of a course, not to be eaten immediately, necessarily, but to be admired, discussed, and understood as a kind of edible theater. At the coronation feast of Henry V in 1413, the subtleties included sculpted figures of a pelican, an antelope, and a tiger, each carrying a written motto, each designed to communicate something specific about the new king's identity and aspirations. Think about that for a moment. The kitchen, the hot, smoke-filled, brutally physical kitchen, was producing political messaging. In sugar, the master cook who designed and executed those pieces was not just a craftsman. He was a communicator. Working with fire and flour and expensive imported sugar, he was contributing to the same performance of power that the herald and the diplomat and the chronicler were engaged in, but from the most invisible room in the castle. And tomorrow night we will follow the food as it leaves that room, as it makes the journey from fire to table, from the world of smoke and labor into the world of candlelight and ceremony. Because that journey, short in distance, long in complexity, is where the two worlds of the feast briefly touch. And what happens at that threshold tells us something profound about how medieval society understood power, performance, and the people who made both possible. Stay with me. We are only just beginning. The morning of a feast day in a great medieval household began before sunrise. Not just early, before the sky showed any light at all, while the hall above was still dark and quiet, while the Lord and his senior guests were still sleeping in chambers that smelled of beeswax and dried herbs. The kitchen complex was already alive. Fires that had been banked overnight were being rebuilt and fed. The master cook, who may have slept only a few hours, if at all, was already moving through his domain, checking preparations, issuing instructions, running the calculation in his head that he had been running for days. How many guests? How many courses? What was the stated theme of the occasion, and how did each dish need to reflect it? What was the Lord's mood, his known preferences, the impression he wanted to make on the specific people sitting at his table tonight? These were not abstract questions. They had direct consequences for what happened in every corner of the kitchen complex. To understand the full scope of what the kitchen was managing, it helps to think about medieval feast structure, because it was nothing like a modern dinner. A great medieval feast did not consist of a starter, a main course, and a dessert. It consisted of a series of courses, often 3, sometimes 4 or more, each of which contained multiple dishes served simultaneously, not one after another, all at once. A single course at a major feast might involve a dozen or more separate dishes, all arriving at the high table at the same moment, arranged in a specific pattern, with specific dishes going to specific places based on the rank of the person sitting nearest to them. This means that the kitchen was not producing a sequence of dishes. It was producing simultaneous waves of dishes, each wave timed to arrive at exactly the right moment, each dish within each wave ready at the same time as every other dish in that wave. The logistics of this were extraordinary. Think about it from the master cook's perspective. You have a large roasting fire producing the main meat dishes. You have a pastry house where the pies and pastries are baking. You have a saucery where the sauces and potages are being finished. You have the subtleties, the elaborate sugar sculptures, being handled with enormous care in a separate space because they cannot be exposed to heat or rough handling. You have bread arriving from the bakehouse. You have wine and ale being organized by the butler and his staff. All of this has to converge at the same moment, at the right temperature, in the correct vessels, carried by the correct people, in the correct order. And if any single element fails, if a sauce burns, if a pastry collapses, if the roasting schedule falls behind, if a subtlety breaks in transit, there is no recovery option that does not involve visible failure in front of the Lord and his most important guests. The pressure in that kitchen was not metaphorical. It was physical, it was constant, and it was high enough that the medieval record contains actual accounts of cooks losing their composure under it, of shouting, of violence, of the master cook striking a subordinate who had made an error that threatened the timing of a course. This was not considered exceptional behavior. It was considered, in context, understandable, because the stakes were real. A botched feast was not merely embarrassing. It was a political event. It could damage a lord's reputation. It could signal weakness to rivals who were present and watching for exactly these kinds of cracks. And the person who bore the most direct responsibility for preventing that, who stood between the Lord's reputation and the chaos of the kitchen, was the master cook. I want to spend a moment with the turnspit, because this figure has slipped almost entirely out of historical memory, and they deserve better. Among the kitchen workers assigned to the roasting fires, the lowest and most grueling role belonged to the people whose only task was to turn the spit. The spit was a long metal rod on which the meat was threaded, suspended horizontally above the fire, held in place at each end by brackets. To cook evenly, the meat had to rotate continuously. Someone had to turn it. For hours, in front of a fire hot enough to roast a large animal, without stopping. In great households, this task was sometimes assigned to dogs. A specific breed, the turnspit dog, was trained to run inside a wheel mounted on the wall, which was connected by mechanism to the spit. But more often than not, it was done by people. By boys specifically. Young, small enough to work in the cramped space near the fire, and at the lowest rung of the kitchen hierarchy, low enough that their physical comfort was simply not a consideration. These boys turned the spit and the heat, sometimes shielding their faces with a wet cloth or a wooden screen, sometimes not. They developed a kind of physical endurance that comes from repetitive labor under difficult conditions. And when the feast was over, when the silver dishes had been carried to the high table, and the guests had applauded the subtlety, and the Lord had expressed his satisfaction with the meal. The turnspit boy's contribution was not acknowledged, not remarked upon, not recorded. He was part of the machinery, necessary, invisible, forgotten. There is something I find quietly devastating about this. Not because it is shocking. By now we understand that medieval society was deeply hierarchical and that the people at the bottom of it endured conditions that people at the top found it convenient not to think about. But because the turnspit boy's labor was not incidental to the feast, it was essential to it. Without that steady rotation, without that hours-long, physically exhausting, repetitive act of turning, the meat would not have cooked evenly. The feast would not have worked. The entire effort of the evening would have unraveled. The Lord's reputation, the alliances being cemented at that high table, the impression being made on the important men eating the perfectly roasted meat, all of it depended, in part, on a small boy in a hot room turning a handle. History is full of these unacknowledged dependencies. The feast is one of the places where they are most visible if you know where to look. Let me take you now into the pastry house, a separate building from the main kitchen, cooler, quieter, with a different quality of concentration. Because the pastry work of a great feast was an art form in its own right, and it belonged to a different kind of specialist. The pastry cook, the pasteler in medieval English, was a skilled craftsman whose work overlapped with architecture as much as cooking. Medieval pies were not what we think of when we use the word today. They were not dishes filled with pastry, where the filling is the point and the crust is just a container. They were structures. A pastry casing, called a coffin, meaning a box or container, was designed to be strong enough to hold its filling through cooking and transport and service. It was often not meant to be eaten at all. It was a vessel, a box made of flour and water and fat, baked hard, filled with the actual food, sealed with a pastry lid, and carried to the table as a self-contained unit. The coffin pie allowed the kitchen to prepare fillings well in advance, seal them inside their pastry containers, and transport them to the hall without spillage or loss of heat. It was practical engineering dressed as food, but it was also a canvas, because the pastry could be decorated. The lids of great feast pies were often ornately worked, impressed with heraldic designs, shaped into decorative forms, painted with food colorings after baking. And then there were the live pies. The historical record contains accounts, some verified, some legendary, all fascinating, of pies that were brought to the table and opened to release live animals. Birds, most commonly. Small birds that would fly up from the opened pie and into the hall to the delight of the guests. The nursery rhyme about 24 blackbirds baked in a pie, that is not a fantasy. It is a memory of a real thing. The technique involved baking an empty pastry shell, then cutting out a circular hole in the bottom, filling the shell with live birds, resealing it, and presenting it at the table as if it were an ordinary pie. When the crust was cut, the birds escaped. The effect, in a candlelit hall with music playing and wine flowing, must have been extraordinary. This was the medieval kitchen at its most theatrical, not just feeding the guests, not just impressing them with the quality of the food, but staging a surprise, creating a moment of shared wonder, making the meal itself into a kind of performance. And the person who made that happen, who engineered the shell, calculated the timing, coordinated the delivery, managed the entirely unpredictable element of live animals in an enclosed space, was the pastry cook, working in the pastry house, known only to those who worked alongside him, unrecorded by name. Outside, the afternoon light is beginning to deepen. In the hall, the trestle tables are being set up, the white linen cloths laid out, the salt cellars positioned with care. The torches in their brackets are being checked. The musicians in the gallery above are tuning their instruments. And in the kitchen complex, the final push has begun. The master cook is moving faster now, his voice sharper, his eye on everything. The fires are at their peak. The sauces are being adjusted and tasted and adjusted again. The pastry cook is making final checks on the pies. The subtlety, whatever elaborate sugar construction has been designed for tonight, is being handled with the extreme care of something irreplaceable. In the scullery, there is already a backlog of things to be washed, and the feast has not even begun. The kitchen is at war with itself, with the clock, with the fire, with the limits of what human hands and human endurance can accomplish in the time available. Let me pause here and draw your attention to something that I think matters. We have been talking about the kitchen as if it were a unified thing, a single operation moving toward a single goal. And in one sense it was. But in another sense, the kitchen was an extraordinarily divided place. The hierarchy that ran through it was as rigid and as socially significant as anything happening at the high table in the hall above. The master cook did not eat with the scullion. The pastry specialist did not consider himself the equal of the boy turning the spit. The kitchen had its own gradations of honor and shame, its own unwritten hierarchy playing out in the same smoky room where the food for the Lord's table was being prepared. Consider what this meant in human terms. The master cook was a man of genuine standing. In the households of great magnates and kings, the head cook received wages that placed him firmly in the upper tier of household servants. He had authority. He gave order. He made decisions with real consequences, and he was held accountable for them in ways that were documented and formal. He might, over a career, accumulate a degree of financial security. He might be mentioned, at least in household accounts, by name. He existed in the written record. The scullion existed in the written record only as a category, not a person, but a function, not a name, but a role. The scullion washed the things the master cook used to make the food that the Lord ate at the feast that the chronicle recorded. At every step of that chain, the person doing the work became a little more invisible, until at the very end, at the level of the actual physical labor in the most difficult conditions, the people had no names at all. They were simply the hand. And yet, and this is the thing that I keep coming back to, the hands were what the feast stood on. The artistry of the master cook meant nothing if the pots he needed were not clean. The elaborate pastry work of the pasteller meant nothing if the ovens were not maintained. The political performance of the feast meant nothing if the fire went out. Every layer of skill and artistry and ceremony rested on a foundation of poorly compensated, physically demanding labor performed by people the historical record did not bother to name. I find this not just sad, but clarifying, because it tells us something true not just about the medieval world, but about how power and visibility have always worked together. The people who benefit most from a system are rarely the ones who do the hardest work to maintain it. The people whose names we remember are rarely the ones whose labor built the memory. The medieval feast is an unusually vivid illustration of this, because the distance between the hall and the kitchen was so short, just a corridor, just a door, and yet the social distance between the people in each space was vast, and almost nobody moved across it in either direction. Now let us add one more layer to our picture of the kitchen, because we have been talking mostly about the human element, the people, their roles, their working conditions. But the kitchen also had to contend with something that no amount of skill or hierarchy or organization could fully control: the food itself. Medieval cooking at the level of a great feast involved ingredients that were, by modern standards, extraordinarily difficult to manage. Without refrigeration, without temperature-controlled storage, without the ability to quickly source replacements if something failed, the meat that arrived at the kitchen might have been traveling for days. Large quantities of fish, particularly prized at feasts because of the religious calendar, which restricted meat on Fridays and during Lent, were often preserved in salt or dried, and had to be reconstituted and prepared in ways that required real skill to make palatable. Fresh produce was seasonal in a way that modern cooking has largely ceased to be. The spices that gave medieval elite cooking much of its character were expensive enough that they were stored under lock and key. Sometimes literally, the spice storage in a great household was a controlled space, and the use of spices was tracked and accounted for in the household records. Saffron, in particular, the dried stigmas of the crocus flower, required in enormous quantities to produce the vivid yellow color that appeared in so many medieval elite dishes, was one of the most expensive commodities in the medieval world, more valuable by weight than gold in some market conditions. To use saffron generously in your feast cooking was not just a culinary choice. It was a financial statement. It was visible proof of resources, of access to trade networks, of the kind of wealth that could afford to literally color its food with one of the world's most expensive substances. And the person who handled that saffron, who ground it, measured it, added it to the sauce at precisely the right moment, was working with something whose value he understood very well. One moment of carelessness could waste more money than he earned in a month. This was the weight that the kitchen carried. Not just the physical weight of pots and carcasses and barrels of wine, but the economic weight of the Lord's resources deployed in a single evening in the service of an occasion that had to succeed completely. And soon, very soon now, the doors between the kitchen world and the hall world will open, and the food will begin its journey. That journey, and the people who made it, and the world they entered when they carried those dishes through the door into the candlelit hall, that is where we are going next. Because what happened in the space between the kitchen and the table was not just logistics. It was a performance of its own. And the people who performed it existed in a strange in-between place, neither the invisible world of the kitchen nor the visible world of the feast, but something in between. Something that tells us more about medieval society than almost anything else. Stay with me. The door between the kitchen and the hall was not a grand door. It was not decorated. It was not wide enough for two people to pass through at the same time carrying large platters. It was in most medieval great houses an unassuming door, heavy, worn smooth at the handle from years of use, opening into a narrow passage that connected the kitchen complex to the service end of the hall. This passage had a name, the Screen's Passage. It ran behind a wooden screen, a tall, carved partition that stood just inside the main entrance of the hall, separating the drafty entry from the dining space proper. The Screen's Passage was, architecturally speaking, a transitional space. It was neither kitchen nor hall. It was the border between two worlds. And it was through this passage, through this narrow, functional, unglamorous corridor, that every dish of every course of every great feast made its final journey from the world of fire and labor to the world of candlelight and ceremony. Think about that for a moment. All of the preparation, all of the days of work, all of the burns and the heat and the shouted instructions and the raw, relentless energy of the kitchen. It all funneled, eventually, through this one narrow passage. And the people who carried it through were not the people who had made it. This is something worth pausing on. In the modern restaurant world, there is a concept developed and formalized in the 19th century by the great French chef Auguste Escoffier, but rooted in structures much older than him, of a clear separation between the kitchen and the dining room. The cooks cook. The servers serve. These are different roles, different skills, different social identities. In the medieval great household, this division was, if anything, even more pronounced. The kitchen workers did not enter the hall during service. They produced the food, they plated it, they carried it to the Screen's Passage, and there it changed hands. The people who received it, who carried it from the passage into the hall, who moved through the candlelit space among the guests, who presented the dishes at table, were a different category of servant entirely. They were the servers, the waiters, the men responsible for the service of the feast. And in a great medieval household, they were not low-status workers. They were, in many cases, young men of relatively good birth, sometimes the sons of minor gentry, sometimes young men placed in a great household specifically to learn the skills of aristocratic service as part of their education. Service at a great table was considered, at the upper levels of medieval society, a skill worth acquiring, not because it was humble, but because it was the opposite of humble. To serve at a great lord's table was to be trusted with the most public and visible expression of that lord's household. It was to move through the most politically charged room in the castle. It was to carry in your hands the objects that represented the Lord's wealth, his taste, his generosity, his power. To do it well, to move smoothly, to present correctly, to understand the protocol of service, to know without being told which dish went to which guest in which order, required a kind of intelligence and social awareness that was genuinely valued. The servers were visible in a way the kitchen workers were not. They were seen. They were noticed. And their competence, or lack of it, reflected directly on the household. Let me give you a sense of what that service actually looked like. When the first course was ready, when the kitchen had completed its first wave of dishes and they had been carried to the screen's passage, the service began with a procession, not an informal carrying of plates, a procession. The dishes were carried out of the screen's passage and into the hall in a specific order, with deliberate ceremony, sometimes accompanied by the sound of a trumpet or a drum that signaled to the guests that the food was arriving. This processional element was not decorative. It was part of the ceremony. It drew everyone's attention to the food, to the number of dishes, to the richness of their presentation, to the smooth efficiency of the service. It was a moment of display, and the Lord at the high table, watching his food arrive, seeing the procession of servers moving down the hall toward him, carrying the evidence of his kitchen skill and his household's organization, was receiving in that moment a kind of tribute. The food was sustenance, but the procession was a statement. There was a specific role in this service that I want to draw your attention to because it has been almost entirely forgotten by popular history, and yet it was one of the most symbolically loaded positions in the entire feast. The carver. The carver, or in grander households, the master carver was the person responsible for cutting the meat at table. In a modern context, this sounds like a minor task. You carve the roast. You put it on the plate. You sit down. But in the medieval hall, carving was a performance. It was a skill. It was, at the highest levels of society, a mark of education and status. The carver stood at the high table in full view of everyone in the hall and cut the meat with a precision and an elegance that was meant to be watched and admired. Medieval carving manuals, and these genuinely existed, written guides to the correct technique, described specific cuts for specific animals, specific ways of holding the knife, specific vocabularies for the act of cutting different creatures. You did not simply cut a fish. You tamed it. You did not cut a hen. You spoiled it. You did not cut a deer. You broke it. Each animal had its own technical term, its own correct method, its own social weight. And the person who knew all of this, who could move through the carving of a feast's worth of meat with skill and composure and a quality that was essentially theatrical, was demonstrating the breadth of his education and the refinement of his upbringing. For noble sons placed in great households to learn the arts of aristocratic life, learning to carve correctly was as important as learning to ride or to handle a sword. It was a social accomplishment, and it happened in full view at the center of the most socially significant room in the castle, standing just as close to the Lord and just as visible, was the cupbearer. The cupbearer's role was, on its surface, simple. He poured the wine. He kept the Lord's cup filled. He managed the flow of drink through the service of the meal. But underneath that apparent simplicity lay one of the more revealing anxieties of medieval aristocratic life. Because the cupbearer did not just pour. He tasted. Before the wine reached the Lord's lips, it passed through the cupbearers. This was not a ceremonial gesture. It was a precaution. Poisoning was a real fear in the medieval world, not a paranoid fantasy, but a genuine and documented method of political assassination that had been used enough times to create lasting anxiety at every level of aristocratic society. The cupbearer's tasting of the wine before service was a practical response to a practical threat. But it was also, over time, a ritual. It became codified, formalized into a specific series of gestures, performed in a specific way that transformed what had begun as a safety measure into something ceremonial. The cupbearer poured a small amount of wine into a flat dish called an assay dish. He drank from it. He waited. He then poured for the Lord. The entire sequence was performed in view of the guests, and in its performance, it communicated something important. It said, "This Lord is significant enough to be worth poisoning. This Lord has enemies. This Lord's death would matter." The precaution was, paradoxically, a statement of power. And the cupbearer, standing at the high table, performing his ritual tasting before the eyes of the assembled hall, was as much an actor in the theater of lordship just as surely as the herald who announced the guests or the minstrel who played from the gallery above. Now I want to bring you to something that tends to be forgotten when we discuss the service of the medieval feast. The sheer physical challenge of it. We have talked about the processional element, the ceremony of bringing food from the screen's passage to the table. But consider what happened after the first dish was set down. The servers did not leave. They stayed. They stood at the sides of the hall or moved quietly between the tables, refilling cups, removing empty dishes, bringing the next element of the course, watching for the signals, a gesture, a glance that told them what was needed. For the duration of a great feast, which might last 3, 4, 5 hours, sometimes longer, the servers were on their feet, moving constantly. In a hot, crowded, candlelit space filled with noise, the sound of 100 conversations, the music from the gallery, the dogs that were almost always present at medieval feasts, moving between the tables looking for scraps, occasionally causing disruptions that the servers had to navigate around. They could not eat, not while they were serving. The food that was passing through their hands, the elaborate, spiced, carefully prepared dishes that represented days of kitchen labor, was not for them. Not yet. There was a system for the feeding of household servants. The lower tables in the hall, the ones furthest from the high table below the salt, were often occupied by senior household staff during the feast. They ate well, relatively speaking. But the servers moving through the hall during service existed in a strange liminal state, surrounded by food, handling food, presenting food, and not eating any of it. It is a small thing, perhaps, but I find it a vivid illustration of the social logic of the medieval feast. The food was simultaneously present everywhere and accessible only to specific people in specific ways. The abundance of the feast was real, but it was distributed through a system of hierarchy so precise that every person in that hall knew exactly what their relationship to the food was and what that relationship said about their position in the world. There is one more element of the service that I want you to know about before we move deeper into the feast itself. The issue of temperature. We have touched on this before, but it deserves its full consideration here. The kitchen was, as we have established, some distance from the hall. The food had to travel through the screens passage, down the length of the hall, to the high table. On a cold English winter evening, and many great feasts were held in winter around Christmas and Epiphany and the great feast days of the religious calendar, that journey took place in drafty corridors and an imperfectly heated hall. The food arrived at the table cooler than it left the kitchen, sometimes considerably cooler. This was a known problem. Medieval households developed various strategies to manage it: heavy covers over dishes, the use of chafing dishes with heated coals underneath, the deliberate sequencing of courses so that foods which could tolerate some cooling arrived at the appropriate moment. But none of these strategies were completely reliable, and there was nothing to be done about it, not really. Because the alternative, serving the food directly from the kitchen, without ceremony, without procession, without the ceremony that the feast demanded, was not an option. The performance was the point, and the performance required distance. Even if that distance cost you the temperature of the food. This is, I think, a perfect small metaphor for how the medieval feast worked. Everything was subordinated to the performance of it. The comfort of the workers, the temperature of the food, the exhaustion of the servers. None of it mattered as much as the impression the feast made on the people sitting at the high table. The display was the feast. Everything else was the price of it. And as the candles burned lower and the courses accumulated and the noise in the hall rose with the wine, there were people moving through that room, watching everything, hearing everything, understanding everything. People who were never mentioned in the chronicles. People who saw the feast from the inside, from the side, from the spaces between the tables. People who knew, perhaps better than anyone, what the feast actually was. And that is exactly where we are going next. Into the hall itself. Among the servers and the minstrels and the women whose presence at the feast was more complicated than the history books have ever quite admitted. Because the feast was not just a room full of powerful men eating elaborate food. It was a social world of extraordinary complexity. And the most interesting people in it were often the ones standing at the edges. Before we step fully into the hall, let us take a moment to consider the almoner. The almoner was a household official, sometimes a chaplain, sometimes a senior servant with that specific designation whose responsibility included the distribution of alms. And at a great medieval feast, the alms distribution had a very specific and very interesting form. The food that was not consumed at the feast, the bread, the half-eaten dishes, the fragments of the elaborate courses that the guests had moved through and left, did not go to waste. Medieval households operated according to a principle of redistribution that was, in its way, remarkably systematic. The leftover food from the high table was distributed first to the lower servants of the household. What remained after that was set aside for the alms basket, collected by the almoner and his staff, carried to the gate of the estate, and distributed to the poor who gathered there. On feast days, that gathering could be substantial. Word traveled. The poor of the surrounding area knew that a great household celebrating a major occasion would have food to give at the gate. They came, they waited, and they received at the end of the evening the remnants of the feast, the broken bread, the cold meat, the pieces of the subtlety that had survived the table. There is something quietly profound about this image. The feast radiated outward in concentric circles of access. At the center, the Lord and his most honored guests, receiving the best of everything. At the next circle, the senior household staff and upper servants eating well at the lower tables. Further out, the kitchen workers and the lower servants receiving their portion after service. And at the furthest circle, beyond the gate, in the cold air outside the walls, the poor of the parish waiting for what the great hall had left behind. The same feast, experienced at every level of the social world simultaneously, each person receiving their portion according to their place in the hierarchy. This is the medieval feast in its full social complexity. Not just a dinner, not just a political performance, but a reenactment of the entire social order from the highest table to the gate every single time it happened. Now, into the hall. There is a detail I want you to hold in your mind as we step fully into the great hall. Picture a server, a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, who has been in this household for 2 years now, learning the skills of service that will serve him for the rest of his life. He is standing near the left wall of the hall, about a third of the way down from the high table. The feast is at its height. The second course has been served. The noise is considerable, dozens of conversations happening simultaneously, the laughter louder now that the wine has been flowing for an hour, the musicians in the gallery above playing something bright and quick that rises and falls over the general din. The server is not eating. He is not sitting. He is watching. And what he is watching, what he cannot help hearing, standing this close, in this place, for this long, is everything. The quiet word passed between two lords near the high table. The expression on the face of a guest who has just received some piece of news. The careful way the steward moves toward the Lord and bends to murmur something, and the slight change in the Lord's posture that follows. The server sees all of this. He hears fragments of conversations that contain, if he were the sort of person to use such things, information of considerable value. And he says nothing, because his survival depends on his silence. The household servant in a great medieval estate occupied a position of unusual intimacy with power. They were present in the most private moments as well as the most public ones. They heard conversations not meant for them. They observed behaviors that the people being observed might prefer to keep private. And in exchange for this intimacy, they were expected, required to demonstrate a kind of absolute discretion that amounted in practice to a performed invisibility. The good servant was the servant who seemed not to notice, who moved through the charged atmosphere of a great lord's hall as if the politics happening around him were simply weather, present, unavoidable, not his concern. This is one of the more psychologically interesting aspects of medieval domestic service, and it is almost entirely absent from the historical record. Because the historical record was written by and for the people at the high table. The people at the margins, the servers, the musicians, the minor attendants, left no accounts of what they saw and heard. Their silence was not only performed, it was permanent. But we can make reasonable inferences. And what those inferences suggest is that the great hall during a feast was a space of extraordinary information density, and that the people moving through it in positions of apparent invisibility were in fact extraordinarily well informed. Let me bring in another figure now, one whose presence at the medieval feast was guaranteed, whose role was central to the event's success, and yet whose social position was one of the most precarious in the entire hall. The minstrel. The medieval minstrel was a professional musician and sometimes also a storyteller, a poet, a juggler, a performer of various kinds depending on the occasion and the household. Minstrels occupied a peculiar place in medieval society. They were valued. Their skills were genuinely prized. A great feast without music was unthinkable. The music was not background noise, but an active component of the event, shaping the mood, marking the transitions between courses, providing entertainment during the gaps in service. And yet the minstrel had no fixed social category. He was not a gentleman. He was not a peasant in the usual sense. He was a professional performer, a category that medieval society found genuinely difficult to place. He traveled. He depended on the patronage of the wealthy. He was welcome in the hall during his performance and dismissed when it was over. He was close to power, standing in the gallery above the high table, playing music that the Lord himself was listening to, and yet entirely at its mercy. His fee depended on the Lord's generosity in the moment. His reputation depended on pleasing people who had the authority to dismiss him without ceremony. The minstrel's freedom was real. He was not bound to a household the way a domestic servant was, and he moved between great houses carrying news and stories and songs from each to the next. But his security was fragile in a way that the household servant's was not. The servant had a position. The minstrel had only his next performance. There were women in the hall too. This is something that the romantic image of the medieval feast sometimes obscures. The great hall during a feast was not an exclusively male space. The lady of the household was present, seated at the high table, beside or near her husband, enacting her own version of the social role the feast required. Her presence was as politically meaningful as his. Her comportment, her dress, her management of the female guests around her, these were all legible to the people watching, all part of the same elaborate display of household status that the feast enacted. But there were also other women in the hall. Women attendants and ladies in waiting who served the noblewomen present. Female guests of various ranks. And, depending on the type of feast and the household, women who occupied more ambiguous positions in the social world of the evening. For women servants moving through a great feast, carrying dishes, serving at table, attending to the needs of the female guests, the night presented particular challenges that their male counterparts did not face. The feast was an occasion of heightened social energy. The wine was flowing. The noise was high. The normal structures of daily household life were somewhat loosened by the occasion, and women moving through that space, particularly young women of low rank with no powerful connection to protect them, were navigating a set of social risks that the men around them were not. We do not have their voices. We do not have their accounts of the feast from where they stood. But we know enough about medieval household life, about the documented patterns of vulnerability that came with female domestic service, to understand that the candlelit hall was not equally festive for everyone in it. For some of the women moving between the tables, the feast was work. Hard, physically demanding, socially precarious work, performed while maintaining the same practiced invisibility that all of the servants maintained, but with less protection and more to lose. This is one of the truths the feast conceals, that the same event could be simultaneously a moment of political magnificence for the people at the high table and a night of sustained difficulty for the people moving around them. The feast was plural. It contained multitudes. What you experienced depended entirely on where you stood. Now let us stay in the hall a little longer, because I want to tell you about a specific moment in the medieval feast that I think captures something essential about the whole strange, layered event. The moment of the subtlety. We talked earlier about the subtlety, the elaborate sugar sculpture that arrived at the end of each major course, not to be eaten immediately, but to be seen, discussed, and understood as a kind of edible theater. Imagine the moment it arrived. The hall, after hours of eating and conversation and music, has reached a kind of plateau. The guests are full, warm, a little wine flushed. The second course is finishing. The servers are beginning to clear. And then a shift in the music. Something slightly more deliberate, more ceremonial. The servers who emerge from the screen's passage are moving more carefully than usual. They are carrying something that requires it. And as the object comes into view, perhaps a castle made of sugar, perhaps a ship with masts of spun toffee, perhaps a set of heraldic animals arranged in a scene that references the Lord's lineage and aspirations, the hall goes quieter. Not completely silent, but attentive. The subtlety is placed on the high table, and for a moment it is simply looked at. The guests at the high table examine it. They read its symbolism because the educated medieval eye could read sugar sculpture the way a modern eye reads graphic design. The animals, the emblems, the poses, the sometimes written mottos affixed to the piece. It was a message sent by the kitchen through the intermediary of the servers to the guests at the table. A message about who this Lord was, what he valued, what he claimed. And the guests who received it were expected to respond not just with appreciation for the sweetness of the thing, but with a kind of intelligent acknowledgement of what it communicated. After it had been sufficiently admired, the subtlety was broken up and eaten. The castle became fragments. The ship's mast was snapped off and passed around. The animals were reduced to pieces of marzipan on a silver plate. All that craft, all that careful sugar work, all that political messaging consumed, gone. And in the kitchen, already the scullions were waiting to wash the plates. Let me linger here for a moment on that image, the subtlety being broken and eaten, because I think it contains something important about the medieval worldview that we can easily miss. The medieval feast was not designed to last. Nothing about it was meant to be permanent. The food was consumed. The sugar sculpture was eaten. The flowers that decorated the table wilted. The white linen, however carefully laundered afterward, would bear the traces of the evening. The music stopped. The guests went to bed, and the hall, that magnificent, candlelit, politically charged space, became an empty room again, smelling of tallow smoke and spilled wine and dog. In one sense, this is the nature of a feast. Of course it ends. Of course the food is eaten. But in the medieval context, the deliberate creation and then consumption of something as elaborate and expensive as a subtlety, a thing that took days to make and minutes to eat, carried a specific kind of meaning. It was a demonstration of abundance so complete that it could afford to waste itself. To commission an elaborate sugar castle and then eat it was to say in the most concrete terms possible, I have enough. More than enough. I can spend this kind of skill and expense on something that will not last the evening. The transience was the point. And the kitchen workers who had spent days producing that transient thing and who now faced the task of cleaning up after it, understood, perhaps better than anyone, the cost of the performance they had served. The feast was still happening. The night was not over. And for the people who had made it possible, who had been working since before dawn, who would be working until well after the guests had retired, the question of when it would end was still very much open. Because after the service came the clearing. After the clearing came the scrubbing. And only after the scrubbing, long after the last candle was snuffed in the hall, would the kitchen finally go quiet. That quiet, what it looked like, what it felt like, what happened to the people who had produced an entire feast and now had to put everything back together again, is where we are going next. Into the aftermath. Into the hours after the last guest had gone to bed and the hall stood empty and the kitchen faced what it always faced after a great feast. The beginning of the same thing all over again. Stay with me. The hall is quieter now. Not silent, not yet, but the character of the noise has changed. The music from the gallery has slowed. The conversations at the lower tables have thinned as servants and lesser guests have drifted toward the door. At the high table, the Lord and his most honored guests are still present, still talking, still drinking, the wine moving more slowly now, the energy of the earlier hours settling into something softer, more reflective. But in the screen's passage, and in the kitchen beyond it, a different kind of shift has already begun. Even before the feast officially ends, even while the musicians are still playing and the Lord is still at table, the process of dismantling begins. This is one of the things that tends to be invisible in the romantic image of the medieval feast. We imagine the event as having a clear endpoint, a moment when the Lord rises, the guests depart, the evening concludes, and that moment exists. But the work of the household does not wait for it. Long before the last guest has gone to bed, the kitchen has already begun its reckoning. The dishes from the earlier courses have been coming back to the scullery in waves throughout the evening, returned from the hall after each course stacked and waiting. The scullions have been washing throughout the feast. Not after it. During it. In the pauses between courses, in the moments when the hall was occupied with the subtlety or with a musical interlude, the scullery was in continuous motion, water heated over the fire, sand and rags applied to the stubborn residue on the bottom of pots, the ceaseless rhythm of washing and stacking and returning vessels to readiness. Because the feast was not a single event followed by a cleanup. It was a rolling operation. And the people at the bottom of the kitchen hierarchy were managing both ends of it simultaneously. The preparation still ongoing at the front, the cleaning already underway at the back. Imagine the weight of that. To be washing the dishes from the second course while the third course is still being plated. To be scrubbing the roasting spits while the kitchen around you is still at full noise and heat. To work in a space where the end of the task is not a moment of rest but a transition to the next task, and then the next, and then the next, until the feast is fully over and the true scale of the cleanup becomes apparent. Before the feast fully ends, there is one more ritual, and it is one that I find quietly moving in a way I did not expect when I first encountered it. In many great medieval households, the formal conclusion of the feast was marked by a final ceremony called the void. The void, from the French voider, to empty or clear, was a final serving of wine and spices, sometimes accompanied by small sweet confections that marked the official end of the meal. It was not a course in the usual sense. It was a departure ritual. The guests would rise. The wine was poured one last time. The spices, usually a mixture of sweetened spices called the spice plate, or épices de chambre, meaning literally the spices of the chamber, were passed around. And this final sharing of wine and sweetness was the signal that the feast was ending, that the evening was moving from the communal space of the hall toward the private spaces of the bedchamber. It was, in its way, a gentle act, a ceremonial softening of the transition from the noise and brightness of the feast to the quiet of the night. The guests who received the void were being eased with deliberate care from the world of the feast back into the ordinary world. And the servants who poured the wine and passed the spice plate were performing, in this final act of service, the same careful attention to the guest's experience that they had maintained throughout the entire evening, even at the end. Even as their own exhaustion was deepest. The service did not relax its standards at the conclusion. It maintained them precisely to the last cup. When the last guest finally leaves the hall, when the Lord and his household retire for the night, when the musicians pack their instruments and descend from the gallery and make their way to wherever they are sleeping, what is left behind is extraordinary. Let me try to give you the picture honestly. The hall, after a great medieval feast, was not a pleasant space. The trestle tables, heavy portable structures that had been assembled for the occasion, were covered in the debris of hours of eating. Bread trenchers, if they had been used instead of plates, thick slices of stale bread that served as an edible platform for the food, absorbing sauces and juices throughout the meal, were saturated, heavy, no longer particularly appetizing. The rushes on the floor. Medieval halls were floored with rushes, the dried stems of marsh grass spread across the stone or earth beneath, had caught everything that fell, spilled, or was dropped during the feast. The bones, the spilled wine, the grease, the remnants of food that the dogs, moving freely through the hall during the meal, had not quite managed to reach before being shooed away. The candles had burned down in their brackets, leaving trails of solidified tallow. The air smelled of all of it, the food, the candle smoke, the press of bodies, the dogs, the wine. This was not a room that cleaned itself. And in a great household, the cleaning of the hall was not a minor task. The rushes had to be removed, not every day but regularly, and after a great feast was a natural moment for it. New rushes had to be laid. The trestle tables had to be broken down and stored. The linen clothes had to be collected for laundering. The candle holders had to be cleaned and replenished. The silver and pewter vessels that had been used at the high table, the salt cellars, the cups, the platters, had to be collected, cleaned, and returned to the care of the butler. All of this was work. Real, physical, unhurried work. The kind of work that does not end quickly. And the people doing it were, by this point in the evening, the same people who had been working since before dawn. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not as an abstraction, but as a physical reality. A kitchen worker who began his day before the sun rose, who spent the morning in preparation, the afternoon in the final frantic push, the evening managing the rolling demands of service and cleanup simultaneously, is now, late into the night, still working. The feast is over. The guests are sleeping. The Lord is in his chamber. The music is finished, and the kitchen boy is still scrubbing, still moving pots, still carrying water. His hands are raw. The skin on his forearms bears the faint marks of the fire he has been working near all day. His back aches in a deep, settled way that comes from hours of bending over a low surface. And the kitchen around him, the enormous, industrial, impossibly demanding space that he has inhabited for 16 or more hours, is slowly, gradually being restored to order. Not for rest, for tomorrow. Because the household does not pause after a great feast. If the guests are still in residence, and often they were, great feasts being occasions that lasted several days, not just one evening, then tomorrow's meals have to be planned and prepared. If the guests have departed, the household still has its own rhythm to maintain, its daily meals, its ongoing needs, its unrelenting requirement for food and drink, and the labor that produced both. The kitchen that had spent a week building toward the feast now had to rebuild itself for whatever came next. The fires that had never quite gone out during the feast preparation would not go out now either. They would be banked and managed through what remained of the night, ready to be built back up in the morning. The master cook, who may have supervised the entire evening without sitting down, would finally allow himself to retire, but not before he had made a final circuit of the kitchen, checking the state of the fires, confirming the inventory of what had been used and what remained, making a preliminary calculation of what tomorrow required. This is leadership of a particular unromantic kind. Not the leadership of the battlefield or the council chamber. The leadership of the kitchen, the constant, unglamorous, essential work of managing people and resources and time in a space where the margin for error is small and the consequences of failure are immediate and visible. And then he would sleep for a few hours in whatever accommodation the household provided for someone of his rank, which, depending on the establishment, might be a small room of his own, or a shared space with other senior staff, or simply a corner of the kitchen itself, where the residual warmth of the banked fires was the closest thing available to comfort. Now let us think about where the other kitchen workers slept. Because this too is part of the story that the feast does not usually tell. The sleeping arrangements of medieval household servants have been documented in fragments across a range of household accounts, ordinances, and architectural evidence. And what they reveal is a picture of communal sleeping that would seem extraordinary to modern eyes, not because it was considered unusual, but because it was simply normal. Large households often had designated sleeping areas for their male servants, sometimes a dormitory-style space, sometimes simply the hall itself, cleared of its trestle tables and spread with pallets or simple bedding after the feast was cleared. The great hall, the room that had hosted the political performance of the evening, became a dormitory at night. The same floor that had held the trestle tables and the white linen and the silver dishes was covered, a few hours later, with sleeping bodies. This transition from the grandeur of the feast to the practicality of a communal sleeping space happened regularly, routinely, without apparent incongruity in the medieval mind. The hall was a functional space. It had many functions. Feasting was one of them. Sleeping was another. The separation of different areas of life into different dedicated rooms, the dining room, the bedroom, the living room, is a relatively recent development in the organization of domestic space. The medieval hall was all of those things at once. And for the servants sleeping on its floor, after a long night of clearing and washing and restoring order, it was, perhaps, enough. A flat surface, a bit of warmth from the dying hearth fire, the particular exhaustion that comes from a day of sustained physical labor. Sleep in those conditions would not have been difficult to find. Let me step back from the immediate scene of the aftermath and talk about something that I think gives the whole story of the medieval feast its deepest meaning. We have spent our time tonight moving through the layers of the feast, from the hall's political architecture to the kitchen's brutal physicality, from the ceremony of the procession to the precarity of the minstrel, from the elaborate sugar sculpture to the scullion washing the dishes while the subtlety was still being admired. And underneath all of it, running through every layer, connecting every room and every role and every person we have encountered, is a single, quiet question. What does it mean to make something that you cannot fully share in? The kitchen worker made the feast. He did not attend the feast, not in the way that the guests attended it. He was present in the building, certainly. He may have caught glimpses of the hall through the screen's passage. He received his portion of the food in his designated place at the appropriate time in the hierarchy. But the experience of the feast, the candlelight, the music, the conversation, the social weight of sitting at a great lord's table and being seen to sit there, that experience was not his. He produced something he could not fully receive. And this, I think, is one of the most quietly human aspects of the medieval feast, and one of the most persistently human things about labor in general. The cook who makes the birthday cake does not eat the cake in the same way as the person whose birthday it is. The carpenter who builds the beautiful house does not live in it. The seamstress who sews the silk gown does not wear it. There is something in the act of skilled labor, in the making of something with real craft and care and knowledge, that creates a particular relationship between the maker and the made thing. A relationship that is intimate and yet asymmetrical, that knows the object completely, its construction, its flaws, its hidden difficulties, and yet receives it differently from the person for whom it was made. The medieval kitchen worker knew the feast better than any guest at the high table. He knew what had gone wrong and been corrected. He knew which sauce had nearly burned. He knew the exact weight of the effort that had gone into the subtlety. He knew the feast from the inside, and yet the record does not preserve his knowledge. The chronicle notes the magnificence of the entertainment, the number of courses, the variety of the dishes, the honor done to the important guests. What it does not note is the name of the person who made the sauce that saved the second course, or the turnspit boy who turned the spit for 6 hours without stopping, or the scullion who washed until midnight so that the kitchen could be ready for the morning. History remembered the feast. The feast required the kitchen. The kitchen required the people in it. And the people in it, their names, their stories, their exhausted experience of a long night's work, those the written record chose not to carry. I think about this not with bitterness, because bitterness is not really useful here, but with a kind of attention, a determination to look at the full picture rather than just the lit portion of it. Because the history that only remembers the high table is a history that has misunderstood the feast. It has seen the performance and missed the labor that held it up. It has remembered the guests and forgotten the hand. And the hands, their skill, their endurance, their particular knowledge of what it takes to make something beautiful out of fire and flour and heat and exhaustion, those hands are history too. Equally history. Perhaps more honestly history, because they had no motive to perform for the record. They worked. And then he would sleep. For a few hours, in whatever accommodation the household provided for someone of his rank, which, depending on the establishment, might be a small room of his own, or a shared space with other senior staff, or simply a corner of the kitchen itself where the residual warmth of the banked fires was the closest thing available to comfort. Let me tell you about the morning after. Because in some ways, the morning after the feast is more revealing than the feast itself. The great hall in the early morning, after a night of communal sleeping, had a particular quality that no chronicle ever thought to describe. The smell of the previous evening was still present, that complex mixture of tallow smoke and spilled wine and the ghost of the food, but now layered over with the simpler smell of sleeping bodies, of breath and wool and the cold morning air coming through whatever gaps existed in the timber and stone. The hall was not yet a hall again. It was still a dormitory. Bodies in various stages of waking, blankets being folded, the low murmur of conversation, someone moving to rebuild the hearth fire. And from the kitchen complex, already, the sound of activity. The fires being fed. Water being put on to heat. The kitchen drawing itself back into its working rhythm, regardless of what the previous day had required of it. This is what strikes me most about the medieval kitchen when I sit with it long enough. It did not get days off. Not even after a great feast. Not even after a week of extraordinary preparation and a night of relentless service and a late cleanup that went well past midnight. The morning came. The household needed to be fed, and the kitchen returned to its work. There is a word I keep coming back to when I think about this. Continuity. The feast was an event, a particular bounded thing with a beginning and an end. But the kitchen's work was not an event. It was a condition. Continuous, uninterrupted, daily, unremarkable. The feast was the exception. The daily labor of feeding a household was the rule. And the daily labor was, in its own way, just as demanding, just less dramatic, less visible, less worth recording. The household accounts of great medieval estates survive in some numbers, and they make for interesting reading if you approach them with the right questions. On the surface, they are dry administrative documents, columns of figures recording expenditure on food, on fuel, on wages, on the thousand small costs of running a large household. But read carefully. They tell a different story. They tell you what the kitchen used every single day, how many loaves of bread were baked, how much ale was brewed, how much firewood was consumed, how many eggs, how much butter, how much salt, how much of the spice supply was drawn down. They tell you, indirectly, how many people were working to produce all of this. And they tell you that the work never stopped. Every day, in every weather, in every season, through illness and feast days and fast days, and the slow monotony of ordinary winter weeks, the kitchen worked. It is a kind of heroism that history has no very good language for, because it is not dramatic. It does not involve a single great act. It involves the repeated, unglamorous, absolutely essential act of keeping people fed. Day after day, fire after fire, pot after pot. And now let me bring you to something I have been holding back, a specific, documented moment that I think gives everything we have discussed tonight its most human face. In the Household Ordinances of Edward IV of England, written in the 1470s and known as the Black Book of the Household, there is a passage that describes the expected behavior and conditions of the kitchen staff in a royal household. It is a bureaucratic document. It is not a piece of literature, but buried within it, in the careful administrative language of the late medieval period, are details that illuminate the human reality of kitchen life in ways that a more self-consciously literary source might miss. The document describes the kitchen boys, the lowest category of kitchen worker, and notes, with a matter-of-factness that speaks volumes, that they are often found sleeping near the kitchen fires at night because they have nowhere else to go. The fires they worked beside all day became, at night, their only source of warmth. The kitchen that had demanded everything from them during the day sheltered them in its residual heat at night. They slept beside the fires they had tended. They woke beside them, and in the morning they tended them again. I find this image, the kitchen boy asleep near the banked fire, curled against the warmth of the same flame that had burned his hands during the day, one of the most quietly dignified images in all of medieval history. Not because it is comfortable. It was not comfortable, but because it is so completely human. The same fire that was used and exhausted was also sheltering. The same work that demanded everything was also providing the basic conditions for survival. The kitchen was not a benevolent place, but it was a place. And for the boys and men who worked in it, it was in some essential way home. Now let us think about what the feast meant to the people who produced it, not abstractly, but in the specific practical terms of their daily lives. For the kitchen workers, a great feast was not a celebration. It was a test, a professional examination conducted in real time in front of the most critical audience imaginable. The master cook who navigated a great feast successfully who delivered every course on time, at the correct temperature, in the correct quantity, without visible disaster, had demonstrated something real and valuable. He had shown that he could manage complexity under pressure, that he could lead a team of difficult, exhausted, stressed people through a sustained operation with high stakes, that he knew his craft completely enough to adapt when things went wrong, and things always went wrong somewhere. For the junior kitchen workers, a great feast was an opportunity of a different kind. It was a chance to be seen by the master cook, to demonstrate skill or reliability or endurance that might lead to a better role, a slight improvement in position, a marginal increase in security. The medieval kitchen was not a meritocracy in any clean sense. Connections mattered. Patronage mattered. Who you knew and who had spoken for you when you entered the household mattered enormously. But within those constraints, performance also mattered. And a great feast, for all its brutality as a working environment, was one of the places where performance was most visible, where the person who kept their composure, who did their task correctly, who showed up for the next shift despite everything, might be noticed, might be remembered, might eventually be given something slightly better. This is the specific kind of hope that sustains people in hard circumstances. Not the hope of dramatic transformation, but the quiet, persistent hope of incremental improvement, of being seen, of mattering in some small way to the people with the power to determine your conditions. I think about that when I think about the medieval feast, about the vast distance between the experience of the Lord at the high table, for whom the feast was a moment of political authority, of social power exercised in its most visible form, and the experience of the kitchen boy by the fire. And I think about how those two experiences were not separate. They were the same event. The same evening, the same candles, the same music, the same food, experienced entirely differently from positions so far apart in the social order that they might as well have been in different worlds, and yet connected, inextricably, undeniably connected. The Lord's feast required the kitchen boy's labor. The kitchen boy depended on the Lord's resources. They needed each other, and they would never have described their relationship that way. The connection was real, and the record only preserved one half of it. Now, I want to end tonight, not in the kitchen and not in the hall, but somewhere between them, back in the screen's passage, that narrow, functional, undecorated corridor between the two worlds. Imagine it now, late in the night, the feast long over. The passage is quiet. The door to the hall is closed. The door to the kitchen is closed. In the hall, perhaps a few servants are already sleeping on their pallets. The fire burned low, the room slowly releasing the warmth and smell of the evening. In the kitchen, a few workers are still moving in the dim light, the final cleanup underway, the fires banked to their overnight state, and the passage between them is empty. just stone and wood and the faint smell of everything that has passed through it tonight. Every dish of every course made its journey through this passage. Every piece of the feast traveled this same path from the world of making to the world of receiving. It is, in its own quiet way, the most important space in the castle. Not the hall, with its high table and its politics and its candlelight. Not the kitchen, with its fire and its hierarchy and its ferocious, unceasing labor. But this passage, this threshold, the place where the invisible labor of the feast became briefly visible if only for the moment it took to carry a dish from one world to the other, and then invisible again. The screen's passage does not appear in the chronicles. No historian wrote about it. No painter included it in their images of the medieval world. But everything that gave the feast its substance passed through it. Everything the history remembered was carried through this space by hands the history forgot. And that, I think, is the truest thing I can tell you about the medieval feast. That its splendor was real. That its politics were real. That the food was genuinely extraordinary, and the music was genuinely beautiful, and the sugar sculptures were genuinely astonishing. And that all of it, every magnificent piece of it, was made by people whose names we do not know, in rooms we have not thought to look at, through a kind of labor that the record considered too ordinary to preserve. The feast shone. The kitchen made it shine. And the hands that made it shine went home in the dark and slept and woke and did it again. Let me give you one final image before we close. It is the morning after the feast, several hours before the household fully wakes. The hall is quiet. A few figures are still sleeping near the hearth, wrapped in their blankets, their breathing slow and deep. Outside, it is not yet fully light. The sky has that particular quality of very early morning, not dark, but not day, the color of pewter, the air cold and absolutely still. In the kitchen, one person is already awake. Not the master cook, not yet. A kitchen boy, one of the younger ones, perhaps, the one whose job has been the fires, is crouched beside the main hearth, carefully feeding the banked embers back to life. He has done this every morning. He will do it every morning for as long as he is in this household. He does not think of it as remarkable. He has no framework for thinking of his work as historically significant or worth preserving or worth telling anyone about. He is doing what needs to be done, keeping the fire alive so that the kitchen can wake, so that the household can be fed, so that another day can begin. And in the small, warm circle of light that the growing fire creates around him, in that medieval morning, in that kitchen, in the aftermath of a feast that the chronicle will remember and he will not, there is a kind of quiet completeness. The feast is over. The work continues. The fire is lit. That is the history behind the feast. Not just the politics and the pageantry, though those were real. Not just the food and the music, though those were real too, but also this: the boy by the fire, the hands in the scullery, the master cook making his calculations in the dark, the servers standing for hours in the candlelit hall, holding their composure, keeping their silence, maintaining the ceremony that made the feast what it was. The minstrel playing the last song as the guests drifted toward the door. The almoner's basket, carried to the gate in the cold, distributed to the people waiting outside the walls. All of them, all of these people, in all of these roles, are part of the same story. A story that the history books told only partially, that remembered the feast and forgot the kitchen, that preserved the names at the high table and let go of the names at the fire. Tonight, we tried to remember them, not with false sentiment. They would not have wanted that, but with honest attention, with a willingness to look at the full picture rather than just the lit portion of it, and with the recognition that the history we have inherited is always, in some measure, incomplete. That behind every grand event there are rooms the record did not enter, people the chronicle did not name, labor that the story never found a way to count. The medieval feast is one of the most vivid illustrations of this that history has to offer, because the contrast between what the hall represented and what the kitchen required is so stark and so human and so close together, just a corridor apart, just a door. And when you walk through that door, in your imagination, when you step from the candlelit hall into the smoke and heat and noise of the kitchen, the history does not become less beautiful. It becomes more true. And I think that is the most valuable thing that this kind of journey can offer. Not disillusionment, not the correction of romance with grim reality, but a fuller picture, a history that holds both the silver dish and the hands that scoured it clean, both the music in the gallery and the silence of the kitchen workers standing still for just a moment, listening, both the subtlety in sugar and the boy by the fire who would never taste it. That fuller picture is the history that lives in all of us, and it is always worth looking for. Thank you for spending this night here with me, for being willing to look past the candlelight and into the kitchen, for sitting with the scullion as well as the Lord and finding the story there just as worth knowing. If this kind of journey into the hidden rooms of history, into the lives that the record almost lost, is the kind of thing you come here for, then Dreamy Ages is exactly where you belong. Come back soon. There are more doors to open, more rooms the history forgot, and I will be here ready to walk through them with you. Sleep well.